You're doing the intro now, right?
Mhm. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am delighted to introduce this virtual event with Jack Halberstam presenting his book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire, in conversation with Rizvana Bradley. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will get through as many questions as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase copies of Wild Things on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Cambridge. We thank you so much for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and of the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce our speakers. Jack Halberstam is professor of English and Gender Studies at Columbia University and the author of several books, including The Queer Art of Failure, Female Masculinity, and Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variability. Rizvana Bradley is incoming assistant professor of film and media at UC Berkeley and was a Helena Rubinstein Critical Studies Fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Her forthcoming book project is a recipient of a Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant, and it offers a critical examination of the Black body across a range of experimental artistic practices that integrate film and other media. Tonight, they'll be discussing Professor Halberstam's new book, Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. Throughout Wild Things, Halberstam engages with the works of a wide variety of writers and artists, from M. Norbese Philip to Maurice Sendak to Kent Monkman, to offer an alternative history of sexuality by tracing the ways in which wildness has been associated with queerness and queer bodies throughout the 20th century. Publishers Weekly called Wild Things a creative, discipline-smashing study and a work that demands attention, which it rewards with both insight and entertainment. I'm honored to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Jack and Rizvana.
Thank you so much, Nell. Thank you to Harvard Bookstore for hosting us tonight. I'm just super excited, first of all, let me say, to be in conversation with Rizvana Bradley, who is somebody from whom I have learned so much, and I cannot wait until your book is out, Rizvana, and I hope we'll get to do a conversation about your book in the near future. So in order to, I don't presume that people have already read the book, other than maybe Rizvana. Rizvana may have read it. I think you've read it. So I'm just going to offer a few of the main arguments from the book and give a couple of examples so that we're not just dealing in complete abstractions and generalities. So when I started, working with the category of wildness, I immediately received lots and lots of pushback. The category was seen as sort of irredeemable in many ways, and that requires then some justification on my part for why I wanted to pitch my tent there in the wild. And so the first argument that I think is worth repeating is that wildness, emerges as a kind of counter category to the idea of civilization within colonial discourse. And that's where the discomfort lies, in trying to take this category and do something more radical with it, because it has been used so forcefully against colonized peoples in particular, Black populations specifically. Just think about that category of wilding that was used against the Central Park Five as an example. Wild has been used to classify people who stand outside of what Sylvia Wynter calls the coloniality of being, who are the other to the human. But for that same reason, because wildness describes people who have been established as outside the category of the human, I argue that a decolonial relationship to the human will want to, at some point, delve into the material classified or declassified by the idea of wildness. So just to give you a sense of the terrain, if you want some sort of bearings for what do we mean by wildness, wildness is like, it's the heart of darkness for Conrad. It's the jungle for Kipling. It's chaotic architecture for Orientalists. It's primitive forms for modernists, right? These are all the things against which modern white humanity establishes itself and its aesthetics against. So in that sense, it holds within it some promise, I would think, for a decolonial philosophy. Wildness, to say it again, is not exhausted by its function as a negative category within civilizational discourse. And just to, set that up a little bit more, you could, the literature that I examine in the book affirmatively is literature that has tried to investigate the wild through an alternative lens. And the children's book that gives its name to the book is Where the Wild Things Are, is just a great example of the way in which we're confronted with a colonial story of a small seeker who leaves his domestic home and goes in search of something else and arrives where the wild things are. So far, so good. But of course, being the colonial traveler, he seeks to make himself king of the wild things and then eventually leaves. And my book asks the question of what happens if we do not leave in what Sendak calls Max's private boat, right? So that's the private that whisks the colonial traveler away. What if we stay in this place where the wild things are? Wild things which are, by the way, ruined, rendered impossible through their opposition to domestic heteronormative household. What if we stay there? What if we explore the wild rather than leave it to its ruination? Okay. Second argument, and I'll do this more quickly just because it's implicit in the first argument, to the extent that we agree with Foucault that sometime in the 17th and 18th century, colonial explorers began to investigate the world through the knowledge production of classification. If we agree with Foucault that this established then a new episteme oriented around an order of things, my book argues with Foucault, in fact, that there must also remain a disorder of things. Okay, so if there is an order of things that has been imposed and contested and refuted and that has expired, then surely there is a disorder of things that limbs this order and threatens repeatedly to upset it. And that disorder actually is given the name in Foucault. Foucault calls it an untamed ecology. And this is, the other side to classification. So number three, my third argument is about the relationship between modernism, modern art and modern literature, and the material culture it absorbs. Okay, I'm arguing that Euro-American modernism is dependent upon all kinds of material cultures that it absorbs and sort of disappears or annihilates. The word for this relationship that I apply is bewilderment. And I talk about an aesthetic of bewilderment within which we can discern the shape and forms of earlier indigenous native folk cultures within modernism, but they have been rendered wild by modernism and unknowable. So from a decolonial perspective, however, and with an anti-Enlightenment intent, we might think about artists and thinkers who want to expose the material culture upon which modernists high culture depends and return wildness to the scripts of modernism. So let me give you an example. If that sounds, very, very contorted, let me give you an example of exactly how this happens. So in, I don't know what chapter it is, chapter 3, I think, I take a look at the production history of The Rite of Spring, as it was choreographed by Nijinsky, Vaslav Nijinsky, to the symphonic work of Stravinsky, with the maestro pulling it all together of Diaghilev. I make the point that all three of these men are by some measure queer. They were involved in sexual relationships with each other and with other men in their sphere. And I think about the irony of these three gay men producing a ballet about fertility rights, a ballet, by the way, in which the men and the women are almost never on the stage at the same time. And then I think carefully about what has been folded into The Rite of Spring that gave this ballet such a shocking veneer when it was performed in 1913 in Paris, when the Parisian audience began booing and shouting, and some of them left the theater altogether. Why was that? And some people say, oh, it's the shock of the new. Oh, it was just so dramatically different. But some people have pointed to the fact that what the Parisian bourgeois audience objected to was the fact that the native folk, the sounds and the movements and the gestures that had been incorporated into the ballet had not been tamed and remained wild. You can see it in the pigeon-toed stance, in the dances, and so on. So the ballet is wild. The ballet has not suppressed the wildness upon which it depends, and yet the ballet is easily recognized as part of a modernist canon. Okay, so where does the bewilderment come in? In 2008, a queer Canadian Swampy Cree two-spirit artist, Kent Monkman, offered a response to this text of this high art text of modernism. The response that he offered was actually to a George Catlin painting titled Dance to the Badash, which is a very well-known, actually very beautiful painting in which a tribal group are arranged around a two-spirit person. And Catlin in his diary wrote about how this was one of the most disgusting spectacles he saw in all of his travels among indigenous tribes, was this dance of the Badash. So Kent Monkman decides to recreate the dance, and he did so in at the Montreal Museum of Fine Art. And he used choreography that had been created by Canadian Cree choreographer Michael Grey Eyes, that was, quote, based upon the traditional powwow and contemporary dance. Finally, and here's a connection back to Rite of Spring, finally, the music was composed by Philip Strong, a Toronto composer, and is, quote, a free syncopated version of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, a modern masterpiece, quote unquote, also inspired by ancient tribal rituals. And so it comes back around that the absorption of wildness by modernism to create the new is supposed to render invisible the material upon which it depends. And yet the queer indigenous artist is able to extract that material, reperform it, queer it, and bewilder. Okay, so that's the meaning of bewilderment in my work. Okay, 2 last points. How am I doing, Rizvana? All right for time? I think we're okay. Yeah. So 2 last points. The middle part of the book sort of argues that wildness offers us a different epistemological frame than the one that Sedgwick lays out in Epistemology of the Closet, which is, of course, a complete paradigm shifting work. And I'm not contesting Sedgwick's work at all. I'm just saying that there are other epistemologies at work in the production of desire. One of them I call an epistemology of the ferox. And the ferox is a Latin word for fierce or wild. And it comes up specifically in the work of a British author, T.H. White, who wrote a book about falconry in the 1930s that was recently brought to light by Helen MacDonald in her 2014 award-winning book, H is for Hawk. And in a way, MacDonald does, it's a beautiful book, H is for Hawk, and it tells the story of Helen MacDonald mourning her father and going through her mourning process by trying to train a hawk, a female hawk, I think you call a female hawk a falcon, trying to train her hawk. She then looks back on the work on falconry by T.H. White, and she becomes a good falconer to his bad falconer. And ultimately, the narrative that she provides for why he's such a bad falconer is that he is a bad sexual subject. He's into S&M. He's a teacher who fantasizes about his students. He likes the idea of spanking. And he even writes a letter at one point to a student saying, it is good to have many lovers in your life, male and female, animal and human. And by the way, it doesn't hurt to have a little sex with furniture too, okay? So T.H. White is this kind of, polymorphous perversity, whereas MacDonald is the perfectly formed subject who mourns properly, who trains the hawk properly, and the hawk here stands for desire, and then who re-enters life at the end of the process. T.H. White, however, is understood to be the loneliest man alive, as his queer biographer, Sylvia Townsend, writes, and he sets himself up in relationship to this category of the ferox. And by the way, this is just a little teaser for the book. White is not the only sort of proto-gay person who writes a narrative about his sexuality connected to falconry. There's, it turns out, a whole subgenre. You'll have to read the book to find out what that subgenre looks like, but there are several amazing books within that subgenre. That said, to return to White, why is he interested in the hawk? Because the hawk, he says, is a creature who you can train, but you cannot tame, which is actually the meaning of feral. To be feral means you cannot be tamed, okay? So he says that it is thrilling to be in relationship to a bird who can be trained only in relationship to the meat that is being offered, but then immediately reverts to a feral state. And he reads this in a book, that the bird immediately reverts to a feral state. So he proposes, quote, that he too would like to return to a feral state. And he writes, the word feral had a kind of magical potency which allied itself with two other words, ferocious and free, fairy, fey, aerial, and other discreditable alliances ranged themselves behind the great chord of ferox. And I just feel like this is a completely unexplored theme. However, if you want to look for the sort of the contemporary version of this, it lies in the Black vernacular of fierce. And I investigate this both through the poetry of Langston Hughes, also through the gorgeous work by Madison Moore on fierceness and fabulousness. And there's even, as Brent Edwards pointed out to me, the first superhero character in comic book history that was Black was the Falcon. Okay, so there are lots and lots of connections here between fierceness and these wild sexualities that we have not properly investigated. So an epistemology of the ferox. Finally, for my last 3 minutes, let me just say a word about zombies. Why not? In a way, at the end of the book, I moved to the zombie, and this sort of returns to earlier work of mine on monstrosity. Monstrosity as always a kind of interesting arrangement of a culture's fears and concerns. And so if Frankenstein, was the monster par excellence of the 18th century, and the vampire was the monster of the 19th century, the zombie is surely the monster of the 21st century. And as with these other monsters, the zombie holds within it a kind of potential, the promise of the monster, as Haraway might put it. And so I explore at the end of the book, the promise and the peril of zombification. The promise of zombies is that the zombie is nothing if not a structure of mass resistance. Let's put it that way. If you watch The Walking Dead or any zombie text, zombies are not particularly lethal on their own. They're lethal because they mass, because they're in huge groups. The herd, they're called a herd. So a herd of zombies is where the power lies. And of course, the zombie also captures this weird state of living death that puts pressure on what we mean by life and what we mean by death. But I also make the argument that zombification names the way in which we tame the wild in exactly the process that I was talking about in relationship to modernism. And the example I give of that is the taking of animals into the household, making animals, taking them out of the wild and making of them pets. And I say that this is a zombification of animal life. That's the chapter that's probably going to be the most controversial in many ways, because apparently during COVID, everyone's gotten a dog. And my critique of dog owning is pretty vicious. Let's just trigger warning for people with dogs. It's a whole scale, double down attack on pet owning as another kind of carceral system in which we want to own the wild. And so we pull these favored animals into our home. Even as we rail against eating meat, we're stroking our pet doggy or inviting the doggy into our bed. And I ask in that chapter about the relationship between pet love and bestiality and why we're so sure they're separated out. Okay, finally, the book is, and this is my last word, it's part of an argument that I will continue into the second volume I'm writing on wildness. It's an argument for unbuilding worlds, right? So if there's an order of things that has established world, then I'm arguing for a disorder of things that will be part and parcel of unbuilding world. And I think, as Rizvana will pick up on this, as part and parcel of a very powerful Afro-pessimist project to end the world, as Calvin Warren might put it. So if earlier moments of queer theorizing were preoccupied with world making, and here I nod to the late, great Jose Munoz, whose posthumous book just came out, A Sense of Brown from Duke. But Munoz was deeply invested in the idea of world making that he shared with his mentor Sedgwick. But I argue in this current crisis that we may well find that far from wanting to, shore up this world or make new spaces within it, we may agree that we long for its destruction. So my book begins the work of imagining the necessary labor of dismantling, unbuilding, destroying, unknowing, and disengaging. And I will stop there. And I'm super excited, Rizvana, to take it from there.
Okay, great. So first off, thank you, Jack, for writing this book. It's incredible. It's an incredible study, particularly because of its sort of eclectic, its eclectic archive, its eclectic set of examples, histories, but also it's sort of the eccentric sexual archive that it gives us, which I want to talk about a bit more with you. But what I want to sort of start with is the sort of contextual backdrop for your study. I think your book emerges against a backdrop of earlier critical studies. One in particular that I'm going to kind of summarize from, or begin summarizing from, is William Cronin's work, who is an environmental historian. And he wrote this essay titled The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature. I believe he wrote it in 1990. And the essay begins with Cronin's declaration, quote, "The time has come to rethink wilderness," end quote. So part of what he does is give you, describe sort of dramatic changes in conceptions of the wilderness over the past 250 years. And so what he does is he moves through the 18th century and the 19th century. And I kind of just want to give this a little bit of context for this, because I think this is where your work comes in. So what he says is that far from being the one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, it is quite profoundly the wilderness that is a human creation, right? And that wilderness hides its unnaturalness behind a mask that is all the more beguiling because it seems so natural. Okay? And so he says, as late as the 18th century, right, to be the very thing we call wilderness, right, was to be deserted, savage, desolate, barren, right? And he says, right, the emotion one was most likely to feel in the presence of wilderness was bewilderment or terror, right, in the 18th century. So we already see how you are retrieving this idea of bewildering terror, which gets explicitly attached in the 18th century to the sublime, right, theories of the sublime. And I'll get to that. But in the theories, most notably of folks like Edmund Burke and Kant and William Gilpin and others, sublime landscapes in particular were those rare places on Earth where one had more chance than elsewhere to, for instance, glimpse the face of God, right? And by the end of the 19th century, as Cronin explains, right, however, all of this starts to change, right? So by the second half of the 19th century, the terrible awe that constituted the sublime, right, in effect becomes domesticated, okay? And so in the 19th century context as well, what you have emerging is, you know, the no less powerful romantic attraction to an idea of primitivism, okay? And the belief that the best antidote to, as Cronin puts it, the ills of an overly refined and civilized modern world was a return to a simpler, more primitive living, right? Or more primitive forms of living. And this becomes embodied in the 19th century most strikingly in the national myth of the frontier, right? And so in this context of frontier discourse, wild country becomes a place of national renewal, the quintessential location for experiencing what it means to be an American, right? And of course that is coded as white, male, settler, etc. So thus you have something emerging like the myth of the vanishing frontier, right? And this lays the seeds of wilderness preservation in the United States, right? And so for instance, right, the movement to set aside national parks and wilderness areas began to gain real momentum precisely at precisely the time that laments about the passing frontier reach their peak, right? So of course you have this like movement to protect the nation's most sacred myth of origin, right? The wilderness. And among the core elements of the frontier myth, right, to sort of speed up my summarizing here, right, is that wilderness becomes the last bastion of rugged individualism, right, which is a phrase that you invoke in your book. And frontier nostalgia becomes a kind of peculiar bourgeois form of anti-modernism. So what happens, right, is that the very men who most benefited from urban industrial capitalism are among those who believe they must escape its debilitating effects, right? And so this is where your contemporary work or study like yours really comes in, but at a radically different angle, right? And point of inflection. And so with your work, what I see happening is questions of sexuality and race, of course, cut into this history, right, at a different angle. And questions of sexuality and race are brought to bear on the sort of different ecologies of wilderness, right, that we see emerging. And I think, as you said, right, I think in your conversation with Jane Bennett, right, earlier in the week, masculinity, it plays a very interesting role in the reconstruction, in your reconstruction of a kind of eccentric sexual archive, right? Which includes, as you've already covered, right, Roger Casement, a British colonial figure who was, as you point out to us, queer, right? And his sexual tourism of Black bodies in the Congo, Nijinsky's performance of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, and Max, the protagonist from Maurice Sendak's, children's book, Where the Wild Things Are, among so many other examples that your book covers. But as you said quite beautifully in that talk earlier in the week, masculinity, right, becomes the sort of, inflection point for this eccentric sexual archive. Because as you said, right, masculinity is, I think you said, the thing that won't absorb its environment, but stands in toxic relationship to it. And so it's really this archive of in part, modern masculinity that figures or fashions the sort of queer modalities of inhabitation and embodiment that subtend wildness, right? So one thing that I wanted to quickly do is to sort of, I compiled something like 7 theses on wildness, according to you, and I just kind of wanted to run through them very quickly. And one of the, the first sort of thesis on wildness that I see you presenting in the book really links up with this long protracted history, right, that somebody like Cronin describes. So the first thing is that you say, one of the first few declarations is that wildness does not promise freedom, right? Nor does it name a new mode of identification. Rather, it offers a rubric for passions, affects, movements, and ways of thinking that exceed conventional oppositions between animal, vegetable, mineral, for instance. The second is that wildness lays waste to oppositions and binaries that structure modern life, right? The third is wildness changes how we do theory, right? Because, as you argue, it messes with an economy of signs, and you turn to Michael Taussig in order to make this argument, right? Wildness challenges the unity of the symbolic function, right? And processes of signification. Fourth, wildness describes modes of knowing and unknowing that emerge in encounters between, as you put it, capital and chaos, privilege and struggle, myth and countermyth. Fifthly, right, wildness asks us to consider different conceptions of temporality, right? The temporality of wildness, as you point out, wildness names what comes after nature, after queerness, right? What the wild is where temporality is uncertain, right, as you say. And wildness is not only where temporality is uncertain, but it is expressed through relation, right? It is improvised. And, you know, interestingly, with wildness, futurity is on hold, as you say. Wildness lies outside of historical time, as you put it. Sixth, wildness designates an unplace, right? What you call an unplace. The wild is the unplace where people who are left outside of domesticity reside, small children, animals, and ruined adults. And lastly, wildness makes us think about sovereignty differently, right? So those are the sort of main claims about wildness that that for me really resonated and I felt would be interesting to pick up on in the discussion. The second, point that I wanted to make is this sort of great, I think, elaboration of wildness as an aesthetics of bewilderment. And I think, again, you are retrieving, typically we understand bewilderment as an impediment to knowledge, as you put it. But here, right, I mean, that's the sort of residual 18th century Kantian sublime sort of notion of bewildered terror and awestruckness, right? But here you're really retrieving it to describe something like, or invest yourself in something like processual sort of philosophy of becoming, right? Becoming, as you put it, as a way of thinking, radically being with, or being in, or being alongside, right? And I think what really is interesting is the way that bewilderment for you draws out an attention to the unmaking and undoing of texts and worlds. Now, so there are a lot of other things that I have to say, but we don't have a lot of time. So I'm particularly interested in wildness's relation to queerness, because wildness is irreducible to queerness, right? Wildness is not the queer, and yet queerness without wildness, as you argue, ends up becoming sort of conventionally attached to logics of closeted queerness and more problematic formulations about queerness that you're trying to revise. But you insist on this formulation of queer theory after nature. I'm interested in talking about that more. I'm also interested in your idea of wildness as bound up with a discourse around the end of the world. And this is sort of where I see, particularly in the chapter on falconry, right? You doing a kind of really interesting reading of Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, right? And really thinking about the second coming as indexing the sort of total moment of ruination, right, that we're situated in. And the reason that that's important, right, and I should mention as an aside that I think this book is compelling because I think it is asking us to think differently about aesthetics, politics, but also ecology and decolonial life practices by way of the wild. But the reason that I think that's important is because you are really, I think, thinking about wildness as a way to underscore, your difference, your sort of critical distance from a discourse that presumes the world is ending, right? Instead of thinking, for instance, that rather that the world has already ended many times for many different kinds of people. And so what I think is interesting is that your work remains attuned to the sort of apocalyptic cataclysms of Middle Passage and settler colonialism. And this is what makes, the sort of, this is what makes your investments not in the salvation of the world, but in the ruination of the world, sort of so resonant with a kind of contemporary, or certain, folks who are writing, in more contemporary contexts in Afro-pessimism. So I'd be interested in, hearing about that, particularly as, you already mentioned in your opening remarks, as in tension with a kind of, genealogy of queer world making and queer theory. I'll stop there, but.
Wow. Okay. That was so great, Rizvana. I need to get those 7 claims about the wild from you. That I got 6 of them written down. That they were really, really helpful, actually, to me. But of course, that the beginning part of your remarks about this, the claiming of the wilderness by this, sort of under the heading of manifest destiny and through the aegis of settler colonialism. I mean, of course, that's exactly the civilizational discourse. It's, we'll decide what must be developed and what must be left empty and what is presumed to be empty in the first place, right? It's that kind of formulation of topography that we call colonialism. And so the wildness that I'm referring to is, of course, as you say, it's not spatial. It's not, let's go to this space or let's look at that space. It's the claim made on space that is colonial, and it's the refusal of that claim and all that goes with it in relationship to an investment in property or an investment in fencing or an investment in openness that is part of the construction that we call man, that wildness has to contest, that wildness contests. And it does so, as you say, without one particular political goal. So we're not trying to harness wildness for a new political project, but just see where these scripts of settling and marking, mapping and knowing, where they fail and how they actually depend upon this other space that will be their undoing. Let's put it that way. That space that will be their undoing is what we could call wild. So then in relationship to queerness, I have as you say, I have a really weird, eccentric archive of sexual misfits. And here I'm very much in conversation with someone like Pete Coviello, whose book, All Tomorrow's Parties, was really influential on me in the sense of noting that when these knowledges, the production, the explosion of expert knowledges at the end of the 19th century that seeks to know and divide, govern and rule, when this results in a kind of paradigm shift that Sedgwick accounts for as the homo hetero binary, thousands of bodies are left out of that paradigm shift. And Pete looks at some of the literatures of those untimely identifications. And part of what I'm doing is thinking about the persistence of that untimeliness and what that then says, not simply about queerness, but about sexuality per se, as it falls out of the mania for classification, what it might look like. And for the bird fanciers in the Falconry chapter, it looks like the desire for the wild, and so you've got this crazy nature writer who I talk about, J.A. Baker, who writes one book, The Peregrine, in which he follows a pair of mating falcons around for a season and writes about them and begins to mimic them and starts to go and sit where they sit and finds himself at the end of the book, baiting over a dead mouse, preparing to fall upon it, becoming falcon, literally. Those kinds of desires are completely outside of these expert knowledges, but the paradigms that we use are dependent upon them. So it's not that we need to know them, it's that we need to look at them to see what else is available. And then finally, in relationship to your comments, I want to draw attention to the piece of the title that I think is important here, which is things, wild things. There's so much powerful material in contemporary Black studies, Zakiya Jackson's work, your work, Fred's work, Frank Wilderson's, all kinds of scholarship that is attentive to the problem of the human. And the human is sort of propped up by not being a thing, if you like. And there's lots and lots of sort of anti-slavery discourse that has to contest thingification, and I understand that. But I think that in my book, I'm also trying to think about things, like think about the category of things, the wild things, and think about how certain bodies and certain modes of being are able to establish themselves separate from the human, and what that can look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think the chapter on falconry is particularly interesting to me because I know you work through, I mean, so you start by saying, right, like the falcon cannot hear the falconer or does not want to, right? And so the sort of, the falconer losing control of his bird, and by implication, the world, is sort of how you read Yeats. And, I'm really interested in the falcon's indifference, or the hawk's indifference, rather, as you say, because I think, what you really do there is sort of elaborate a sort of a different critical language for thinking about sovereignty. The sovereignty of the falconer is, and I know you move through Derrida and read him in a very interesting kind of way in order to make this point, but that the sovereign is bound up with the bestial, right? In become sort of enfleshed with my word with the bestial in ways that really sort of undoes, right, the sort of sovereign claim on the animal, or something like this. And I'm interested in that as a way to think about or extend, or how it extends in your work, a kind of critique of humanism. I mean, I know that you talked about your chapter on animal domestication and pets as potentially controversial. I find it really interesting that you use as an example the protagonist character from Huysman's Against Nature, Des Esseintes, and you talk about Des Esseintes gilding the tortoise, like painting this tortoise gold, and you say this is like absolutely the most repulsive form of, well, I'm paraphrasing you, but animal domestication, right? But I'm interested in why for you that's the case, or perhaps not in tension with a kind of queer making of, or remaking of, a reanimation or reenchantment with the object, for instance. I mean, that's a very specific example, but I'm wondering why you read it as, domestication, zombie humanism, as you say.
But there's two different things there, like Des Esseintes, bringing the tortoise into his house, and he's an aesthete who has left the city because it's just too much. It's too boring. It's too bothersome. But this book Against Nature is sort of the best expression of a queer refusal of the natural. It's like, oh, I'm unnatural. You know what? I'm not unnatural. I'm anti-natural. I don't want anything to do with nature. And then the aesthete retreats to his country home and just basically preoccupies himself with interior design questions. And one of them is about bringing this tortoise into his living room and then realizing that the shell sort of clashes with his carpet, which is deeply bothersome to him. So he encrusts it with gold and with jewels until the tortoise expires under the weight of the aesthetic, literally. So that's not about domestication. It's about aestheticization of the animal for the purpose of, this completely disconnected aesthetic, I guess. So the animal chapter, it just gets people so angry. I'm interested in the fact that people are so angry to have pets critiqued in this way. I mean, isn't it obvious that we're asking animals to do a kind of affective labor for us? We're horrified as a society by bestiality, but we invite dogs and cats into our beds and kiss them and fondle them, but we're sure we're not being sexual with them. where, you know, there are many, many arguments made about the production of meat, because it's so clear what the industrial and what the economic ramifications are. But the pet industry is also a massive, massive industry, mostly fueled by, it turns out, white couples without children who want a different kind of subject to demonstrate their sovereignty over, and who then have huge influence in the cities that they live in and turn every available site into dog runs, you know, or bathrooms, dog bathrooms. So my critique of pet owning is, you know, I've joked to my friends that I'm going to run for mayor of Brooklyn on the anti-dog platform, which means I will never ever win this, but I'm so against pet owning at this point. And it's not that I'm saying, oh, these animals should be free. The argument is that the version of the human that people are so infatuated with in relationship to the pet is precisely the version of the human that we should be. And I think we are critiquing.
I think we have to open it up for
Okay, let's do that. Let's go to some questions. Okay.
All right. So I'll start with the most complex one. We have a few questions, but so this is a two-parter. So first, how do we celebrate the wild as a critical epistemology while acknowledging its ongoing entanglement with the other, Black, queer, non-Western, etc., and steering away from cultural appropriation to perform the other? And then part two, how can decolonialism and classificatory knowledge systems coexist? Does decolonialism hinge on the dissolution of all classifications and distinctions?
Wow, that's a good question, Lucy. Thank you. Rizvana will help me. How do we celebrate the wild as a critical epistemology while acknowledging? Well, that's what I was doing, wasn't it? I'm not really celebrating the wild. I'm suggesting that we live in relationship to the wild and wildness all the time, and that it is entangled in these colonial operations. But as I said in my opening statements, it is not exhausted by them, and it continues to fascinate us. Not as part of that kind of settler colonial idea of an empty space that requires me, the white, rugged man, to enter it and conquer it anew, but it's enchanting as a space that is indifferent to the human, indifferent to the human, and not particularly hospitable to it either. As for whether the decolonial hinges upon the dissolution of all classifications, you know, that no, that's not the point, that we must undo all these systems of classification. It's more that the work is to understand how those systems of classification operate, what ways there are around them, rather than always and everywhere leaning into them, you know, which is what Foucault, of course, called the reverse discourse. So we're not trying to just do away with something. In fact, the other night someone said, well, I guess you would be the person who wants to like just get rid of gender, right? You don't really get rid of things that are part of the episteme within which you exist. You can't vanish things. So what I think is involved in a decolonial relationship to knowledge is recognizing when an episteme is over and when it's expired. And this is something that Paul Preciado has been speaking about a lot recently. When an episteme is expired and when new, potentially terrifying or potentially exciting epistemes are available. And that seems to be the work.
Rizvana, did you want to follow up with that? Or
yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think Jack's argument is that, you know, and I'm not going to sort of get into my differences with the argument, but right now, but, you know, I think the argument goes, Jack, right, that wildness is unleashed by colonial brutality, but exceeds, right, a colonial will to power, right? And there are forms of wildness that exceed precisely the colonial modes of violence that produce them, right? And when you see, right, that excess, right, come into vibrant form, right, materialize as vibrant form, that's where you see, right, that's where you become bewildered, right? Texts, different kinds of texts, different sorts of operations, illuminate the sort of failures and fissures of modernism. That's when bewilderment happens, right? I think that's the argument.
That's so lovely. And it actually speaks to something that happens a lot now in the classroom, where you'll show something that is, maybe you'll show a text from like the 60s that is homophobic by contemporary standards. And the students are bothered by it because it's homophobic. There's a kind of bewilderment there, but what are we to do with that? And there's lots of things to do with text that are born out of a kind of, as you're saying, Rizvana, that are the byproducts of a colonial system, but that exceed it. There's still potentially something available in the aesthetic that hasn't been exhausted by the colonial inscription. And that's the work, right? Is trying to figure out, can something still happen here? And it's hard to teach, it's hard to do, but it is a method of some sort.
But and it's a method that, as you insist, right, is sustained or sustains a set of paradoxes that should not be resolved, right? That are irresolvable, should not be resolved.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Politics.
Yeah. All right, let's see here. So Austin Svedjan asks, I'm curious if you see this new work in its emphasizing of the disorder of things as continuing the specific kind of negativity you present in the queer art of failure. If so, what resonances ought we dutiful readers of yours to notice between wildness and failure?
Wow, do I have dutiful readers? Okay, thank you, Austin. That's lovely, actually. Yes, I mean, there are definitely connections there, and I think this book it has elements of the failure book in that, as the Publishers Weekly said, it has a sort of orientation to entertainment, and you'll see it in the zombie chapter and the chapter on the secret life of pets and so on. But it is it's a book that's quite interested in the dark, in the dark side of the human. And I think that I'm going for it with Wildness in a way that I didn't with Failure. I think Failure was still quite redeemable in that book. And I think Wildness is not here, as Rizvana keeps making clear.
And let's see, an anonymous attendee asks, when does tame become a synonym for conquer or destroy? Does your writing touch upon wildness as an especially now ever vanishing presence? I mean, Rizvana, your questions touched on that a lot, but as for that second question, is taming always synonymous?
Is taming always a synonym for conquer or destroy? I mean, in my book, I think taming is very much about domestication and the norm, being folded into a kind of normativity. And that's because I'm interested in the relationship between disorder and desire. So I think, but I do think that there's a connection between taming and destruction, taming and stilling. And you can see it in Where the Wild Things Are. It's what's so great about that text as a kind of allegory for what we're talking about. In a way, Max goes to where the wild things are to be wild among them. But because he figures out how to scare the wild things by looking into their eyes, he becomes their king, at which point they are tame. So he must leave. It's the exact kind of colonial trajectory. So I think, I I think it's hard for taming to exceed that particular logic.
Rizvana, I don't if there's anything you'd like to add to that, or let's see here, and we have Stefan asks, how do we respond in a queer modality to this displacement of affective labor towards non-humans in preference over humans? It feels like a disturbing trend when isolation and loneliness is becoming an increasing threat to human well-being and health, yet the obsession over pets and objects seems currently very normative.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's. I mean, people just seem to think this is the way through isolation, is to get the dog, but at stake for me in this discussion about pets is how deeply committed people are to finding or at least wanting to be recognized for their benevolence in relationship to animals through their relationship to a pet. This is supposed to be some indication of what a good person you are, that you have sustained a relationship to a non-human creature. And what I call zombie anti-humanism is the way in which, and this goes back to the last question about taming, everything the human touches turns to a kind of prosthetic extension of the human. And that is so true of the pet. And the best example I can give is all those funny pictures online where people hold up the picture of the pet and the picture of the owner, and they are the same, right? So that's the zombification. I also give the example of the Monty Python skit about the dead parrot, John Cleese goes into the pet store and says, I'd like to return this parrot. And the owner says, why? And he says, because it's dead. And he says, it's not dead, it's just sleeping. And my point is, any pet you go into a pet store and buy is dead. It's already dead. It's just living dead. And yes, it looks cozy and funny and furry and it does tricks, but it's dead.
Mm-hmm. And there's one more question that we have in here. I don't know, this is probably quick. Does your use of bewilderment and discussion of modernist use of folk art have any ties to Fovism?
Just briefly, Fovism was, about the use of color and was supposed to be an inscription, again, a kind of primitivist inscription of wildness. So it comes up briefly, but it's part of that larger claim about modernism that it absorbs all of these other aesthetic expressions into this supposedly text, this master set of the best things that have ever been written or said, while disappearing the material that inspired it. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a question from Madison.
Yeah. Let's see here. Can you talk about how you assembled this wide-ranging archive of material related to wildness?
That is such a good question, because I think the archive is pretty messy. And I want to make a claim for it as messy, but then again, maybe Rizvana will want to jump in, but then again, it's also weirdly unified at the beginning. I mean, there's a lot of material in there that comes straight out of modernist canon, T.S. Eliot and Joseph Conrad and Nijinsky and so on. Why is it like that? Because I'm saying that you have to investigate the canon in order to find the material that has been drained, by the canonical works. And then, the next step is to try to figure out what is the material that allows us to bewilder or to step into bewilderment. Some of the work was just obvious, like Where the Wild Things Are, and then Jan Martel's The Life of Pi is a perfect example of this relationship between a youth and a Bengal tiger, where it seems like they're cooperating, and the character Pi is sure that he has a sympathy with the tiger that the tiger absolutely refuses to reciprocate. So there's a kind of, some of the work is just obvious in terms of this human inability to recognize or grapple with the wild. And then some of the material is like, you know, eclectic and specific to my own tastes, let's put it that way. I think I couldn't do without the zombie stuff, even though I think the zombie chapter probably feels like you're turning a corner into another project. I think that the rampaging zombies are, you know, they are like the id, just moving across an open landscape. But they also are irredeemable, and they capture something about what this world that we live in fears in relationship to, you know, what Hart and Agree call the multitudes, the massive numbers of people who are simply transformed into living dead by the operations of capital and neocolonialism.
Well, I think we probably ought to end it there. Thank you so much to Jack and Rizvana for this conversation. Thanks to all of you out there for spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this remarkable book and purchase copies of Wild Things at harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Mass., have a good night. Keep reading and stay safe. Thanks again to both of you.
Rizvana, thank you.
So much.